Hello GES111 students, and welcome to another online delivery of our lecture content. In this case, lecture 16, our third lecture on globalization. In this lecture, we're going to look at the cultural dimensions of globalization. So how we see globalization played out in everyday culture. In today's examples, we're going to look at commodity cultures, particularly the commodities of food, and how food travels across the world, particularly through large TNCs or transnational corporations like you see here, McDonald's. It's a brand we see all around the world, but wherever we do see McDonald's around the world, we see different expressions of what McDonald's is through the food, the menu items offered, the way that they're presented, the way they're consumed, the flavors, the ingredients. So you see some similarities in globalization. You notice the brand, the logo never changes. It is ubiquitous, meaning found everywhere around the world, and it appears the same. But at the same time, it's also unique to the cultures in which they're found. So that's what we're going to explore today. And these debates around globalization are varied. The debates range from a broad-based agreement that culture has become increasingly global, and we see this through global brands that we wear, that we recognize, that are part of our everyday lives. So this is kind of a cultural globalization, and it leads to an understanding of what we might call a global village. And we'll talk more about this metaphor of the global village on Thursday in our discussion of the metaphors under globalization. But when culture becomes the same around the world, we become almost like a village that is in very close contact with each other, even though we might be on the other side of the world. Another argument that comes out of globalization is this debate or fear that this range of flows of people, images, and these large TNCs lead to the convergence of consumer practices, meaning the way we consume products, the products that we do consume, comes together, so that those practices and tastes are really singular and usually following an American model, and that American model is creating what we might call a global culture. So this is a way of understanding globalization in a very negative light, where culture is lost in favor of a globalized, Americanized brand culture. But it's not always the case. Because one of the things we see under globalization, remember, globalization is a process, and that is that the process of transformations, the spatial transformations that happen through globalizations are not identical. So globalization affects other space, place, and time around the world in different ways. So what does globalization do? It transforms the local cultural field. That cultural field is one that is comprised of language, identity, and history. So we see changes in language that happen under globalization. Consider, for example, the popularization of rap music coming out of the States from the 1980s, 1990s. It's created a global language which emerges in music. Global identities, people want to dress the same, look the same. And of course, this also affects our histories, how we look back at our history, how we understand the present, and probably how we'll understand the future as well. So oftentimes, cultural globalization has the effect of transforming local societies. And if you remember back on a discussion about scale and community, it's on that very local scale of a community that lives in proximity that globalization has the biggest impact, because those very small scale settlements are usually homogeneous. They're the same. People speak the same language, they eat the same foods, they understand their identity in the same ways. But cultural globalization impacts that. It actually brings in another more global view of identity, language, and history. And from this week's reading, or excuse me, last week's reading, one of the things which we can take away from it is a very important idea of forms of flow that influence cultural practice. So the geographer Arjun Appadurai has theorized these flows. And there are, as he has recognized, 5 forms of flow that influence cultural practice. Let's look at those 5 in turn. The first form of flow is what Appadurai calls ethnoscapes. Let's think of the root of this word, ethno. Ethno is about people. So ethnoscapes are the global landscape of persons. And these are persons that are mobile, that are moving. So tourists, workers, refugees, and others who are mobile. So if we think about it, when people move around the planet, they take with them their culture. So ethnoscapes are an important form of flow that actually transfers cultural ideas. It's a way of transferring globalization. A second form of flow is what Appadurai calls technoscapes. Now, if you remember, we talked a lot thus far about the impact of technology on globalization. So technoscapes is where the technology helps to reconfigure time and space. It's the impact of technology in allowing these flows to happen. Some of the examples we've discussed already are the container ship and the jet aircraft. Both of these technologies have had a huge influence on globalization and its ability to spread culture around the world. The third form of flow is financescapes. Now, remember back to our discussion of mobilities. One of the things that we can see as being mobile is capital, money. So financescapes are the high-speed global circuits of capital. So globalization wouldn't occur if it weren't for the movement and the flows of capital. Capital has to move around the world, and very swiftly. Think of a company like McDonald's, with its headquarters in the United States, managing a network of thousands of restaurants around the world. It wouldn't happen if it weren't for flows of capital moving in and out of countries around the world. The fourth form of flow is mediascapes. Now, media can be in either visual or printed forms. It can be in the form of social media. It can be in the form of television, film, radio. So these mediascapes are the networks that actually produce and distribute information. It moves around the world. It influences our daily lives. So the 24-hour news cycle we see around the world of breaking news, that actually creates a whole different experience of the world. The world seems very small if we watch a global news service and learn about events that have just taken place on the other side of the world. And the final form of flow is ideoscapes. This is about ideologies, often political ideologies and values. And these are transferred and circulated through the mediascapes. So this is the sharing of ideas, political ideologies and such. So as we transfer them around the world, ideas change and they change us. We change the way we think about the world. So these are the 5 forms of flow that influence cultural practice, according to Apadarai. And there are important ways to understand globalization because it's the ways that globalization is actually implemented. So, under cultural globalization, we can often think about cultural commodities. So, commodities are the things that we consume. It might be food, it might be music, it might be clothing, it might be entertainment. So, what is it that some fear about cultural globalization? Well, they fear that globalization creates sameness or homogeneity, and that the world is becoming Americanized. But really, is such a fear justified? Are we losing our culture if we consume McDonald's? Or is that culture just somehow influenced by this global culture, but retains a bit of the local as well? So what we like to think is that under globalization, cultural practice is not replaced, but it's rather interacts with the global. So this relationship between the local and the global scales is really what we see mostly during globalization. So the meaning and form of cultural commodities often change as they move across space and time. This is an important quote from Falconbridge and Beaverstock. What are they saying here? They're saying that a particular cultural commodity, let's take, for example, food. So the meaning of a particular kind of food and the form that it takes may change as it moves across the world. So we might find the taste and look of a McDonald's hamburger might be slightly different in South Africa than it is in the United States, or in Germany, where I am right now, or in Japan, or in China, or elsewhere. So in this way, we can see globalization as a practice that doesn't replace the local culture, but actually blends with it, shaping it into something else. And this is where we get the idea of glocalization. Let's look carefully at that spelling. It's not globalization now, it's glocalization. It's the melding of the global and the local. So glocalization is the adaptation of international products around particular elements of local culture. This is about integration, where a commodity is integrated into the local market, the local culture. And we'll take a look at one example that Falconbridge and Beaverstock have used in their writing. And that is the example of masala curry sauce, and they also talk a bit about McDonald's as well. So what happens with the cultural geographies of food and this idea of glocalization? Well, when these food commodities move across the world, so across space, place, and time, they're often deterritorialized. They are taken out of their territory or their land where they come from. They are made global. And then what happens is that they are then again re-territorialized. They are taken into a new territory, a new land, and made local again. So this is the process we see in cultural globalization, a constant process of deterritorialization, taking something out of its origins, bringing it to the global stage, and then reintroducing it to a new culture, a new land, to make it local again. So let's look at the example that they use in their article, and that is the example of tikka masala sauce. What is tikka masala sauce? Well, many of you may know already. It's a traditional Indian curry. It's made of a very complex mix of spices, and it's often very strong. It's very hot. So it's a particular kind of Indian curry which has a very particular history, a very particular set of ingredients, and a very particular taste. But under globalization, what do we see? We see that not only people are moving around the world, but their cultures are moving with them. We are consuming media about those places. So if we're seeing film and movies, um, listening to music about a particular place, we may in fact want to try their food as well. So what happens to this tikka masala sauce is it becomes deterritorialized, taken out of India, and moved into the global market. And in the case of our reading from Falconbridge and Beaverstock, they write about how it is taken into the UK market. But in the UK market, something interesting happens. With the example of pataks, this tikka masala sauce, it's changed its form, it's changed in some ways its ingredients. It's a completely different sauce. Now it's British style. It's ready to eat. It's not something that takes a long time to prepare with a complex mix of spices. It's pre-cooked. All you must do is heat it through. It still has a complex mix of spices, but it's much milder to appeal to the palate, to the tastes of those in the United Kingdom. So what do we see through this example? We see that sometimes when a cultural commodity is deterritorialized and reterritorialized, they move across space. What we get is not a reproduction, exactly what it is in India, but something that is hybrid. It's a hybrid form. It's not the same as it was in India, but it's not a direct copy. It's something which is appropriate for the market in the United Kingdom. This is what we see happening in the cultural commodities of food under globalization. We also see these kinds of cultural geographies of food again through the example of McDonald's. So if we look at the example of McDonald's in Hong Kong, people in Hong Kong have really taken up fast foods, particularly American style fast foods. Now Hong Kong is known as a place with a very long and very proud culinary tradition, or tradition of food. But McDonald's hasn't taken away the history and culture of food in Hong Kong. And the people of Hong Kong haven't given those up and taken on an Americanized way. In fact, what's happened is the people of Hong Kong have adapted McDonald's to suit their tastes. It's become now part of a hybrid of their food tastes. So whereas McDonald's was first exotic in Hong Kong, it's now part of local culture. At McDonald's in Hong Kong, other parts of China, they actually have menu items that are very traditionally Chinese, not just the Big Mac. So you see what happens with cultural commodities under globalization is they become integrated in the market. This is the impact that globalization has. To use another example, we can look at McDonald's in India. Did you know that McDonald's has vegetarian restaurants in India? Not all of them. But in 2013, they opened 2 new restaurants that were completely vegetarian. And this, of course, caters to the Muslim and Hindu majority who will not eat beef for religious reasons. And those outlets are near 2 important pilgrimage sites. So what has happened? Well, McDonald's hasn't changed the cultural practice of Muslims and Hindus in India. They've adapted to it. And what we get out of that is a brand new form of food, at least for McDonald's, the McVeggie, which is a vegetarian version of the Big Mac. So while we see that fast food culture has spread around the world, it's been accepted across the world, it hasn't replaced local culture. So if we take what Doreen Massey says, she suggests that this sort of global effect of culture is taken on in different ways around the world. So that re-territorialization of a global commodity is an interesting process because we start to see a bit of the local in the global. We see it in our own examples. Look at the Streetwise One pap on the left. Now, KFC doesn't have pap anywhere else around the world. It's a South African thing. You won't find pap on a menu in the United States. You won't find it in Germany. You won't find it in Hong Kong. But it's something which has been made part of KFC as the process of globalization has re-territorialized the streetwise meal in the South African context. And on the right, well, hey, love local, love the booty burger, you know? It says it all. Local is lekker. Nowhere else will we find in McDonald's around the world something called a booty burger. It's very unique to South Africa as well. So these are examples of re-territorialization, where the global actually takes on a local flavor. So here's another long but important quote from Falconbridge and Beaverstock. What do we know about the effects on global culture and cultural practices of globalization? Well, we know that there are examples of ubiquitous, homogeneous, and hegemonic cultural forms. Ubiquitous meaning found everywhere, homogeneous meaning the same, and hegemonic meaning powerful. So there are examples of this. Again, large international brands are found everywhere. They're ubiquitous. McDonald's can be seen as a homogeneous food commodity. It's the same and powerful, hegemonic. But at the same time, the way that those products are reproduced and brought into local culture creates something which is very uniquely local. So we have to see that this is how the process of globalization actually occurs. So to summarize, we can say that there are a number of debates around cultural globalization. They all converge with this idea that the culture has become increasingly global. But what we can't forget about this is that while culture has become global, the way that those global cultures are re-territorialized or brought into the local is extremely unique. So it's that spatial transformation of cultural commodities where we see unique outcomes around the world. Globalization has a way of transforming the local cultural fields, that is language, identity, and history. The global acts on the local, and we get out of it this idea of globalization. We must recognize those 5 forms of flow that influence cultural practice, as Arjun Appadurai has identified them. And those are, of course, ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, mediascapes, and ideoscapes. And through the example of cultural commodities, including but not limited to food, we can see how globalization acts on them, how they become deterritorialized and then re-territorialized under this process of globalization. And then, of course, from that we learn about this idea of glocalization, where international products are actually adapted to the particularities of a local culture where they're sold. And that process allows integration of local markets from global ideas. So these are the key ideas to take away from this subsection on cultural globalization. If you haven't already, please do read this week's reading on globalization. It does summarize some of the key ideas we learned from last week's reading. That's also available on eCanva. There is a prac this week. Please remind yourself that there is a prac in spite of the fact that I'm away. And on Thursday, lecture 17, where we'll talk about the metaphors of globalization, remember that that is online as well. I hope you have a good week ahead, and I look forward to chatting with you more on Thursday with lecture 17. Take care.